What if we talk about information overload? In the past video, we were talking about the fear of missing out, part 1 and part 2. If you want to know more about it, please check those out. Following the same line, let's talk about what we do with that information. In terms of social media usage, with the development of information technology, there are more channels for individuals to obtain a large amount of information than before. The negative results brought about by too much information have also attracted increasing attention from researchers, because social media is something that just arrived to stay. Humans have a limited ability to process information, and information that exceeds this ability will lead to performance degradation. And you can find more with Hunter and its investigation of 2004. Information overload is defined as a situation in which a large amount of input information exceeds the information processing capacity of an individual. Various social media networks have been used as sources of crisis events and related information. For example, during the pandemic. At the same time, young people frequently and excessively participate in social media activities and continuously obtain information from the past, present, and a possible future, which may lead to an overload of relevant information and lead to adverse psychological consequences. We also talk about the retention of that information and our own memory capacity. With excessive amount of information, and as we were talking in the past, they cannot be related one with another. We have in a short amount of time so much information that we cannot fully process each single one properly. Is this something that occurs as intentional, or is it something that just develop in terms of tracking and analyzing the natural user social media user behavior throughout the time? Was this something that we created as an unwanted or unconscious pattern, and then companies just catch that pattern and use it for their enhancement of algorithms? Or was it something that was in the contrary, that the companies just pursue that first before us? Large amounts of information can be generated and disseminated rapidly on social media. Information overload occurs when people are exposed to more information than they can process efficiently. Have you feel like you cannot just pay attention to everything at once, especially in social media? This can lead to psychological adverse consequences. The limited capacity mode shows that individuals have limited resources to process information, according to Lan in 2000. It was believed that information overload has an impact on social media fatigue. In a social media environment, users acquire vast amounts of information. However, the stress of social media induced information overload can lead to emotional fatigue in users. So we don't only talk about the memory and attention processes, we also talk about our interpersonal relationships with others, our emotions and feelings. When users cannot effectively integrate, absorb, and utilize too much information, it will have an impact on work, life, and interpersonal relationships. Information overload on social media may trigger users fatigue. So it could be that information overload is positively related to social media fatigue. Is it? The notion of information overload appears everywhere in our popular media as a characterization of something specific and emblematic of our era of life in a time of telephones and web browsers and related. So much defines our self understanding today that it is hard to remember that it has a history that stretches back to the 50s, much less to the 1750s or even 1550s. Equally strange is the persistence of the rhetoric of novelty that accompanies so all a phenomenon. Information overload has been claimed to be both the major issue of our time and a complete non-issue. It has been cited as an important factor in inter alia science, medicine, education, politics, governance, business and marketing, planning for smart cities, access to news, personal data tracking, home life, use of social media, and online shopping. It has even influenced literature. A perspective may be gained by setting information overload in the framework provided by Luciano Floridi's concept of the fourth revolution. Floridi's scheme has three periods in humanity's development: prehistory, before recorded information; history, when society was assisted by recorded information; and hyperhistory, which society depend on and defined by information and communication technologies. The move to hyperhistory is parallel by the development of the condition of all life, whereby life is lived simultaneously online and offline in an infosphere. And this infosphere can be like a spider web in which everyone is connected, even without not wanting to. This is a dramatic change, and one which occurs only once in the lifetime of a species. For the generation which has lived through it, it is hardly surprising to find new problems and issues arising, and information overload can be understood as one of these. This phrase, information overload, is attributed to the American social scientist Bertram Gross in 1964, who used it to refer to this state when the information inputs to any system exceed its information processes capabilities. And when we have this phrase, we can think about a machine. Am I right? Although this term has been the most commonly used, the phenomenon has been referred to by many other names as information overabundance, infobesity, infocloud, data smoke, and others. Also, I want to include cognitive overload, which might be really related, very similar with this one. But the history of the concept of information overload has been discussed by a number of writers, particularly detailed and scholarly treatment, not confined to the Western context being provided by Blair in 2003 and 2010 by the contributors to a special issue of the Journal of the History of Ideas by Rosenberg in 2003. The concept, though not the phrase, is usually taken as originating at the end of the 19th century with George Simmel, a German sociologist and philosopher, being the first to analyze it in modern terms. But its roots can be traced much further back. Overload was explicitly acknowledged at the Royal Society Scientific Information Conference in 1948, which was highly influential in dictating the pattern for academic and professional information services at the start of the digital age. At the conference, not for the first time in history but more than ever before, there was a fear that scientists would be overwhelmed, that they would no longer be able to control the vast amounts of potentially relevant material that were pouring forth from the wolf's presses. And the torrents and rivers of current literature pour themselves into libraries, adding without cease to what is already there. The first scientific treatment of the overload phenomenon is ascribed to the American psychologist George Miller, who detailed many examples of what would come to be called overload, based on psychological studies of the limits to human capacity to deal with information. See Galbraith in 1974 for an early reflection on the relevance of these kinds of studies to dealing with practical problems of overload. Information overload first became noted as a potential problem for business and government in the 1960s, summed up by Wilinski in 1968. Information has always been a source of power, but it is now increasingly a source of confusion. In every sphere of modern life, the chronic condition is the surfeit of information, poorly integrated or lost somewhere in the system. Alvin Toffler's influential book, Future Shock, in 1970, first brought the phenomenon to wide attention. He described overload as causing both physical and psychological distress due to overloading of perception, cognition, and decision-making process. By the technological advances transforming industrial society. By 1984, the leading scientific publisher, Eugene Garfield, was writing of the already well-defined disease information in or information overload. Up to the 70s, overload was largely a matter of journal and report literature for academics and professionals, and of consumer choice for the general public. It became a major and general issue of concern and focus in the 80s and 90s. With the widespread adoption of digital sources and then the internet, it was realized and transformation had occurred. The fundamental problem was no longer finding information, but filtering and controlling it. While the old social media fought against the scarcity of information, new media are fighting the overabundance of information. It may be concluded that a perception of information overload has existed for almost as long as information has been recorded. though its nature and causes have changed drastically over time. There is no single generally accepted definition of information overload. It is a slippery and contested concept. It is easy to give numbers to show increasing volumes of information, but the problem is not just amount. It is also to do with diversity, complexion, choices, confusion, and with harm caused by information. It is notable that these factors are present in metaphors often used for overload: flood, deluge, smog, and others. In other words, that can be described as information overload as well. There is a recurring question as to what exactly everyone is overloaded with. Is it information, data, documents, ideas, ideologies? It has been usual for commentators to suggest that people are drowning in information or data, but lacking on knowledge, and often quoting T.A. Eliot's lines saying the following: "Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information?" This is not a new question. It has been pointed out that the information explosion in early modern Europe in the 17th and 16th centuries was variously regarded as a dramatic increase in the number of books, the amount of descriptive facts, and the number of authoritative voices. It may be noted that overload has generally been explained and defined in rather pragmatic and informational terms. Edmund and Morris in 2000 and Epler and Mangus in 2004, they give typical lists of their date, mainly characterized as an unmanageable volume of information. See Bawden and Robinson in 2009, Spire in 2016, and Johnson Kelly in 2018. Other explanations drawing on the 21st century contents. Few have discussed the topic invoking a formal or philosophical approach. One of these examples is Floridi, who analyzes aspects of overload in terms of his philosophy of information. Another is Spire, who examines overload using the ideas of Horkheimer and Adorno, concluding that overload is a feature of a capitalist culture industry, whereby the increase in cultural messages in the media leaves individuals with fewer capacities for reflection and critical thinking, and whereby individuals are active agents in their own overloading, in that they actively consume more information artifacts than they can interpret or understand. A third is Capurro, whose analysis refers in part to Heidegger and Foucault. A 2017 statement by the International Federation of Library Associations suggests that the exponential growth in the availability of information brought to us by technological advances brings not only promise, but for many a sense of information overload and frustrations linked to a lack of confidence in using digital tools. Overload is here taken as being caused by technology bringing us too much information, made worse by a sense that there is not adequate control over the flood. But what do you think? Do we have too much information nowadays? More than we could ever manage? Do you think we should have access to that much pieces of information? Or perhaps yes, that we should have right to that and more? I will be continuing this topic on the following video. Let me know your answer to your questions. See you another time.